Over the course of my years in news, I've had the good fortune to travel to many places around the globe. And there's some where the echoes of history still ring strong.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
President Franklin Roosevelt's words still hover over Pearl Harbor.
Was suddenly and deliberately attacked.
It's been 70 years since that fateful day when war was unleashed.
I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost.
The attack on Pearl Harbor may have taken place in Hawaii, but the entire nation was changed in an instant. Well, December 7th, 1941, I had just turned 10 years old. I was bedridden with what turned out to be, we didn't know it at that time, rheumatic fever. And I was in bed, and the radio was my constant companion.
Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
Attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
I'm not sure that I could have pointed the Hawaiian Islands out on a map at that time, and had never heard of Pearl Harbor. But I immediately called out to my father, who was in the other room, who immediately, the expression on his face changed so much so quickly that I knew this was something really serious. I remember my father heading downtown, like men across the country, ready to enlist in a long war they knew was coming.
Representative Sam Rabin, Speaker of the House of Representatives, has just called the House into session again.
By the next day, Monday, my family's attention, like that of the nation, had turned to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C.
The committee is coming in at this time, and I believe the President is arriving, Mr. Warner.
I was glued to the radio, listening to the events unfolding like the play-by-play of some sporting event.
The President is arriving right now, accompanied by his...
But we all knew the stakes were so much higher.
He's coming in rather slowly.
One congressman after another, one senator after another, public figures on the radio before the President spoke. And what I remarked to myself, even at 10 years old at the time, and upon reflection, all the more remarkable, there was not a discouraging word. It was all about unity.
With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God.
The generation that rose to this challenge is now making its exit. There were an estimated 77,000 servicemen who were at or near Pearl Harbor that December 2nd.
This thing here, do I push it up or down?
Yeah, down.
About 2,700 remain alive today.
This side has got a lot of information.
They tend not to be excessively sentimental, approaching old age with honesty and grit.
Shall we have a Christmas party this year?
Whatever.
We usually do.
Yeah, we didn't have one last year.
That's
for
right.
summer.
It's probably better with just so few.
Yeah, yeah.
Mal Middlesworth, James Lee, and Peyton Smith are all Pearl Harbor survivors. The last living members of the 9th chapter of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association. They get together about every other month at the Radisson Hotel in Ontario, California, to share stories and mark the passing of time.
And the kid said, Pearl Harbor survivor. That must really be an old fart. Well, they were coming down this way, and I was coming, and I met them, and I heard what they were saying.
Yeah.
So they got a history lesson. Yeah. Right on the spot.
They've been holding meetings in this hotel for years. They once needed a much bigger room.
Well, the Pearl Harbor Survivor Association is an organization of military personnel who were stationed on the island of Oahu at 7:55 a.m. or within 3.5 miles of the shore on December 7th, 1941. You either were there or you weren't.
Middlesworth joined the Survivors Association about 20 years ago. He was the longest-serving president, twice vice president,
That's you.
and the editor of their quarterly newsletter.
And those you can't even see anymore.
Middlesworth and his wife Jo Jean were high school sweethearts.
Fiji.
Their scrapbooks are filled with pictures of Mal's time as an 18-year-old Marine. He was assigned to the USS San Francisco, a cruiser based in Pearl Harbor.
But it was the Royal Hawaiian.
He had only been there 2 months when the Japanese attacked. For Mal, the details of that December 7th are still fresh in his mind.
That's probably one of the most famous pictures of Pearl Harbor. And I knew the two key players. This man in the water with the fire right next to him is named Bill Moore, and he was in our chapter. And he was burned over about, 60% of his body. He was in burn wards for 3 years. Now, at the 50th anniversary of the attack, I walked by a guy who was standing there telling somebody how he picked up this sailor, Bill Moore, off the West Virginia. And I said, have you ever met the fellow that you picked up in the water that day? And he said, no. I said, well, let me come over and introduce you. So I took John Latko, who was a Marine off the West Virginia, over, and he met Bill Moore from my chapter. They didn't know each other's name, they never met, and I introduced them to one another. Well, that's the kind of thing I run into all the time. Last time I saw John Latko was at the 65th anniversary in Pearl Harbor, and he was in a wheelchair and had dementia. I could talk to him for a little bit, but he didn't remember me.
Mal and Jo Jean are making the trip back for the 70th anniversary. Quite possibly their last to these hallowed waters. Every year, more than 1 million visitors from around the world come to Pearl Harbor to visit the iconic memorial to the USS Arizona, making this place the most popular tourist attraction in Hawaii. The USS Arizona is the site of the single greatest loss of life from that December 7th.
The magazine exploded. The ship ripped apart. A ball of fire and smoke.
1,177 sailors and Marines died when the mighty battleship was struck by Japanese planes. The fatalities from this one ship comprised nearly half of the total American deaths on that day. About 900 men remain entombed inside.
Well, I don't think anybody can go out in that memorial and realize there's a sunken ship down below, and their bodies still there 70 years ago, without getting some thought, some introspection, some personal feeling from that tribute down there. The names of all the men will give them an understanding of how fragile life is.
I'm a Pearl Harbor survivor, veteran of World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the Cold War. Hey.
May I take your picture with my boys?
Sure. Hurry up, boys.
Hurry up, boys.
My time is valuable. I'm getting older.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's my favorite when I get the young people, even those from Hollywood.
Journalists often use the phrase, too often becomes almost a cliche, of walking, breathing history.
The only light that we had on the whole island of Oahu was the burning of the Arizona.
But these are men who were there at Pearl Harbor. I would submit that there are very few people who can think as vividly, talk as energetically, and remember as much. They are, by any measure, national treasures.
Then I was a swinging bachelor for a while.
And I was both humbled and honored to be in their presence. Well, Captain, I want to take you back to December 7th, 1941. Tell me what happened.
Well, I was out the night before at a cookout at Kailua Beach, which is perhaps 30, 40 miles from Schofield Barracks. I returned at 2 a.m. and about 5 minutes to 8, there was a terrific explosion in the area. When we ran out on the lanai, a plane flew by from our left to our right, and it wasn't an Army plane, so therefore, to our way of thinking, it must be Navy or Marine out on a maneuver.
When I came outside, I looked over towards Battleship Row, and the planes were diving on the battleway. I said, something wrong, we don't train on Sunday. Then I saw one of the planes turn off to the right, and the rising sun on the fuselage and wingtips. My God, those are Japanese planes.
I looked on my lap and I saw the Arizona just completely enveloped in flames. The other battleships are all ablaze. Oklahoma had already been torpedoed and she killed over, and I could see little dark objects scrambling on the hull of the ship.
So I spent the next 4 hours out there in the water trying to pick people up. We was in our shorts and t-shirt, and the water had caught fire from the diesel leaking out of the hit ship, and we was having to swim underwater. So I'd break water, see somebody to pick up, go back under and pick them up.
It only lasted for 2 hours, thank goodness, and then it was all over. It just got blank quiet. My family here in Honolulu, I was living with my sister right near Waikiki. The phones were restricted, we couldn't call home. Fortunately, there was a guy delivering bread, a friend of mine, and I told him to call my sister and tell him we're still alive.
What is your most vivid memory of that day?
Well, I think seeing the planes flying low enough and seeing the Japanese pilot with his cap and everything, it was scary. It was scary for a few minutes, so we took our .30 caliber rifles and started shooting at him.
I'll go back to you, Herb. What is your most vivid memory of the day?
Of that day was seeing the sight of the Arizona in flames. The ship was just covered with flames, and that sight of the hull, I can never forget that at all.
Pearl Harbor survivor members have a very unique relationship with one another. They're not like the American Legion or the Marine Corps League or the Veterans of Foreign Wars. First of all, because we're bound together by age. We don't get any new members. Or if we get new members, they're in their 90s.
In other words, the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association is an organization with an expiration date. It's a reality that Mal Middlesworth and other national leaders chose to confront recently.
So the first thing we did is we decided unanimously to shut down on December 31st, 2011.
Middlesworth said he could no longer ask members to do the arduous work of running an organization.
We had just had a district director resign because he had cancer. His replacement, who came to the meeting, had leukemia and cancer. The national president had whipped cancer about 4 years ago. So I was very concerned about their health and their future so they could have some remaining good days of their lives. They had given so much to the organization. It was time for them to rest, time for them to get back to their family and concentrate on their own experience in the remaining years they had left in their life. After all, I'm one of the young ones. I'm 89.
The survivors who live near Pearl Harbor are members of the Aloha chapter of the National Association. That would be chapter number 1.
Forever have my gratitude.
Robert Kinsler is their president and secretary.
What used to be mail call or final mail call or taps or something in our magazine, there would be 1 or 2 names. Now it's 3 or 4 pages. So we're passing away at a fairly rapid time. Now the oldest member of our particular chapter is 94. He's here this morning. And the youngest is 88. So we're all in between there. And fortunately, we've been, either it's the climate or the Hawaii atmosphere, but we seem to be lingering longer than those on the mainland.
And while the national chapter is shutting down, you're keeping your organization alive here.
Maybe as a social gathering rather than a formal club meeting, but we're going to carry on to the best of our ability.
Well, I really appreciate you talking to me this morning. We appreciate your service to our country.
It's a pleasure.
We admire your stamina and the fact that you're still on this side of the grass.
Yeah, I wake up in the morning, I don't see roots, so I figure I'm going to be good for another day. Thank you very much, and it's a really...
First time I came to Hawaii was with President Dwight Eisenhower at the end of his 2-term presidency. I was really taken aback by the beauty of the place. I'm now older, am I ever? And I've been a few places and seen a few things. But to this day, I've never had the immediate recognition of this is one of the most beautiful places on earth.
Hawaii is a volcanic archipelago, almost 3,000 miles from the nearest continent, making it the most isolated inhabited place on Earth. Its oldest islands were formed 5 million years ago. Its newest are still a work in progress. These rich lands and temperate climate have proved alluring to most everyone who set foot here, starting with Polynesian adventurers from the South Pacific who settled on the islands more than 1,000 years ago. They traveled here by canoe, over miles upon miles of open ocean, guided only by the stars. Today, of course, jet travel has opened the islands to the world. Tourism is by far the state's biggest industry. Last year, nearly 7 million visitors came to Hawaii, pumping more than $11 billion into the state's economy. Some come to take in the sun. Some to explore the natural wonders. Some come here to get married, and some to pamper themselves. Hawaii has changed greatly since I first came here in 1960. There was no Arizona Memorial at the time, just a simple plaque on a rock honoring those who died in the attack. But the movement to build a more fitting tribute was well underway. In 1958, that movement got a boost from the popular television show, This Is Your Life.
Hello, everybody. This is Ralph Edwards speaking to you from Pearl Harbor on Oahu in the Hawaiian Islands. Now, the planes you see coming now are friendly U.S. Navy planes, of course, but 17 years ago they were enemy bombers who struck this great Pacific naval base in a surprise attack that ushered in what has been called the day which will live in infamy.
At the time, there was nothing but a wooden platform over the Arizona. The man being profiled that night was retired Admiral Samuel G. Fuqua, who was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his heroic deeds on December 7th, when, as a junior officer, he took command of the Arizona after she was hit.
Well, this is all about something mighty wonderful. Admiral Samuel Glenn Fuqua, this is your life.
At the end of the program, Edwards addressed viewers directly with this appeal.
A commission has been appointed by the governor of the territory of Hawaii to raise the funds, and the Navy has been authorized by Congress to accept and to use the money that comes in to enshrine the USS Arizona. Are there 1 million, 2 million more of you out there in our audience who will put a dollar bill in an envelope?
The show ended up raising over $95,000. 3 years later, another $64,000 came from a benefit concert given by Elvis Presley in Honolulu. Later that year, $150,000 from the federal government got the memorial built.
Well, this idea came about in the late 1950s.
On a recent windy fall afternoon, I spent some time on the Arizona Memorial with the National Park Service's chief historian for Pearl Harbor, Daniel Martinez.
But the design of opening it up.
He's the kind of historian a history buff like me could listen to for hours.
It's a beautiful design.
Well, it's unlike any memorial at that time. I mean, the tradition of what you see in Washington was what people expected, and some of the people were shocked. They called it, a crushed milk carton.
But in the years since, this modern, elegant structure has been embraced by the public. Martinez told me the Navy required that any memorial to the Arizona not touch the sunken ship itself. So the architect, Alfred Price, designed a suspension type of bridge that seems to float above the water.
And it's right over the sunken ship.
It's right over it. The stern is right there. Mm-hmm. And then right forward here, Dan, is the bow. So you get an idea of a ship 2 football fields long.
Right.
And one of the things that Alfred didn't intend, but it happened. Just step over here for a moment and then look up this way. And you can see the Old Glory framed by his design. Right. No matter where you go, you get this picture of this unique memorial to this fallen ship.
Martinez told me later that this striking image had not been part of Price's original design. The Navy had just hoisted up a flag after the building was complete. Now, nobody could imagine this place without it.
And, looking at this, the trade winds blowing through here in the late afternoon, it does, there's something about this place that allows this kind of freedom that you feel aboard here. And yet you have this gesture of sadness because below you are 900 men still entombed in the ship.
Of the 335 men who survived the attack on the Arizona that day, many have chosen to join their fallen shipmates in death. Their cremated remains interred on the ship below. Martinez shared with me the story of a conversation he had with Frank Campbell about his wish to have the Arizona be his resting place.
And I asked Mr. Campbell, I said, Mr. Campbell, why is this so important to you? And he said, son, you've got to understand, I've been living on borrowed time. And my place is with my crew, my shipmate. This was the end of a journey. And in a way, they had earned it.
Frank Campbell's ashes were interred on the Arizona on December 7th, 1996. I love this, as you come out of this great open space into a hallowed sanctuary.
Well, this memorial room, he wanted people to pause. Whatever they were thinking, they would drop that because they were going into a confined space and they were going into that room. And they enter the room where 1,177 names of officers, sailors, and Marines are inscribed on Vermont marble.
Over the years, many millions have come to pay their respects. The first president of the United States to visit the memorial was John F. Kennedy, himself a veteran of the Navy who had seen fighting in the Pacific. In 1961, Kennedy signed legislation to provide the final funding needed to complete the memorial. And he traveled here in June of 1963 to see the results, just 5 months before his assassination. If you spend some time on the memorial, there are many sights that cause you to pause and think. Rusty remains still protrude from the water. And every once in a while you catch the sheen of oil on the water surface, still leaking from the ship. Some call this the black tears of the Arizona. In the memorial room, light streams in from open spaces, in what may at first glance seem to be an abstract array of shapes, but the guidebooks will tell you that they comprise, in fact, a tree of life. One of the things I personally like about putting the tree of life and making it part of the stitching that goes through the whole memorial is it's international. Almost every country has some version
That's
of the
right.
tree of life.
And you picked up exactly what Alfred Price wanted. He wanted no religious ownership or cultural ownership. He wanted to be a universal symbol, so all people from all over the world would see this as a symbol of peace and harmony, which it represents.
Coming to the Arizona today, it's hard to remember that this ship was once very much alive.
Most people don't realize today that this was a ship that was literally a city that went to sea. It had a post office, it had a laundry, it had a bakery, and even a gidunk, which was a soda fountain.
It was a forerunner of the modern aircraft carrier.
In many, many ways.
The USS Arizona was built in the Brooklyn Navy Yard and commissioned in 1916. She was named after the 48th state, the last state to join the Union before World War II.
And so to be on this ship was a high honor because she was the flagship of Battleship Division I, and that's why Admiral Kidd was aboard and lost. So this was the pride of the state of Arizona. Arizona had provided the Silver Service, and all of the states through these battleships are named after. There was a pride, and when the Arizona, the California, the West Virginia, the Nevada, the Oklahoma, when all of those ships went down or were damaged, they took that personally in those states. So there was an attachment to it. And so that's kind of been lost over the years of what these ships named after states meant to the people of the United States.
For more than 30 years, the southern view from the Arizona Memorial was of the open waters of Pearl Harbor. But today, the sunken battleship is no longer alone. She has a fitting partner, floating only a couple of hundred yards away. The battleship Missouri was brought here in the late 1990s. This is the famous vessel on whose decks the Japanese surrendered in Tokyo Bay, the 2nd of September, 1945.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world,
General Douglas MacArthur announced the end of hostilities in the Pacific.
and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
Every year, thousands of Japanese tourists come to visit Pearl Harbor. I've always wondered about their feelings after they tour the site.
Aloha. It's an honor for us to have you here. We're very excited that you are here.
During our visit, we met a group of Japanese high school students and their teacher who came to see Pearl Harbor as part of their international studies class. And there's a lot to study at Pearl Harbor today. On December 7th, 2010, the doors opened on a new $57 million visitor center that has the welcoming feel of a college campus. The Japanese students toured its new museums,
The memorial stands over the sunken hulk of the battleship Arizona.
watched a video presentation, and then took the boat ride out to the Arizona Memorial, where they observed a moment of silence. At the end of their visit, they presented 1,000 origami cranes, a Japanese tradition that has become a symbol for peace. The student body president said he was not prepared for the power of seeing this site in person.
私がここの真珠湾に来るまでは教科書で得た知識というものしかなかったんですが、実際ここに来て、生の写真や先ほどの映画や、本当に沈んでしまったアリゾナ艦を見て、私の語彙力もないからなんですが、戦争の悲惨さとか、辛さのがもう言葉にできないような気持ちになってしまって。
I think many first-time Japanese visitors feel scared to go to Pearl Harbor.
Dr. Eugene Yaguchi is a professor specializing in American studies at the prestigious University of Tokyo. Professor Yaguchi has made studying the Japanese response to Pearl Harbor a cornerstone of his scholarship, particularly the iconic Arizona Memorial.
Memorials tend to be a site where national memory or national remembrance is focused. Pearl Harbor and USS Arizona Memorial is a place where one remembers those soldiers who died for the nation of the United States and reflect on the need for national defense, the importance of protecting one's country.
By contrast, Yaguchi says the Japanese visitor comes to the memorial with an entirely different cultural context. The war that followed Pearl Harbor ended with atomic bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In total, an estimated 500,000 Japanese civilians died during World War II.
For the majority of Japanese visitors who visited the site, those who I spoke to always said, well, this is why we have to have peace. This is why we should never have wars again. This is why we should never repeat the kind of war that we did in the first half of the 20th century. So the dead are buried in the ship, and there's a memorial going over the ship. And this is actually a very difficult concept for many Japanese visitors because you don't step on the dead here in Japan, right?
He worries that the history of World War II in general, and Pearl Harbor specifically, gets too little attention in Japanese schools. For example, he likes to point out how this widely used high school textbook gives the attack only one sentence. Professor Yaguchi says, with that background, it's not surprising that a trip to Pearl Harbor is such a powerful experience for a Japanese tourist.
They come and look at the museum, go to the memorial, and see the extent of the damage that the Japanese caused. And there's a sense of transformation among many because they realize what really happened there. And that's a very sobering experience for them.
The first sight upon entering the visitor center is a map of the Pacific on the eve of war.
And so this was one of the things that we wanted to have. We wanted to communicate to the visitor the expanse of the largest battlefield in World War II.
National Park Service historian Daniel Martinez says it's unfortunate that we tend to study World War II from a Eurocentric point of view, that it began with the Nazis invading Poland in 1939.
Now Hitler's threat, today Germany, tomorrow the world, was both believed and feared.
But it was Japan, not Germany, that first invaded a sovereign nation, China, in 1937. And it was clear that Japan's militaristic government was bent on building an empire in Asia and the Pacific.
Question, why did the United States sleep? There was indication after indication that things were going from bad to worse with the Japanese.
It's not very flattering, but it was believed that the Japanese were incapable of taking on the United States. The Pacific Fleet was moved out here as part of a message to Japan that we meant business. But the message that Japan interpreted was, you've now moved 2,500 miles closer and you're a threat. And so this misinterpretation by both sides is leading to some assumptions of what should happen in the next few months. And for the Japanese, now in power with the militarists, they turn towards the Japanese Navy that you may be called upon to launch an attack against the United States.
Well, that's what I think is missing in many people's memory and or knowledge, including to an extent my own, that it wasn't just Pearl Harbor. It was Malaysia, Hong Kong, Philippines.
All the way down into Indochina, all the way down deep in the Solomons and in that area. It's almost unimaginable that they spread their forces out in such a manner, and within 6 months have launched staggering defeats of the Allied powers, and in particular the United States. We hadn't known that kind of defeat since the American Revolution.
There were fierce battles all across the Pacific. On land, on the sea, and in the air. Eventually, the tide of war swung in favor of the United States, but the bloody conflicts continued. Japan was ultimately defeated, completely and unconditionally. Its cities lay in ruins.
Yokohama, razed and seared by the fire bombs.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leveled by the atomic bomb.
This was Hiroshima. The first atomic bombing of August 6th completely leveled 4 square miles, constituting 60% of the city.
During our visit, Daniel Martinez welcomed the governor of Hiroshima, who was on a tour that began at the atomic bomb site and would conclude at Ground Zero in New York. The purpose of the trip was to promote peace.
Well, we had now a long history of peace for 66 years, almost 67 years now. And I think we have come to reconciliation in most of people's mind. There may be some who still have harsh feelings in each countries, but our relationship shows that even enemies with the harshest conflict can come together and be friends.
Now the oil may last over 100 years coming up. We do know the ship will last about 600 to 800 years. For me, the reconciliation, to foster it, to be part of it, it seemed to me to be very important. My grandfather, who witnessed the attack and was angered by the attack, also cautioned me that bitterness brings on more bitterness, and that if allowed, time will heal all wounds. And that's what left an impression on me. And in 1983, the first Japanese pilots returned unceremoniously, unannounced, and went to the memorial. And one of the park rangers saw them and recognized those have to be veterans. And so the superintendent approached them and said, "Are you veterans?" And they were a little suspicious, but there was a park ranger that spoke Japanese, and they said, "Well, we are. Were you at Pearl Harbor?" "Well, we were. And we noticed you came and offered prayers for the dead. Was that the intention?" He says, "Yes." So we wanted this to be the oh wow moment. And you heard the roar of the aircraft coming over, And this Tom Freeman illustration, one of the great Marine artists, did this portrait of the Pacific Fleet main battle line, and in front of you is what the Japanese aviators saw.
Many of the Japanese pilots who took part in Pearl Harbor said they had been told Japan declared war against the United States before the attack. Japan had not.
It was a matter of shame for those pilots who survived, a matter of honor. And so they felt in their hearts they needed to come to Hawaii to pray for our dead that they were the instruments of.
So I remember we had a machine gun in there.
Today, you know, when you come to this place, our new theme is From Engagement to Peace.
There are a lot of opportunities for new perspectives at Pearl Harbor today, like the first draft of FDR's speech on December 8th, complete with his handwritten edits. A date which will live in world history became a date which will live in infamy. There's an unexploded Japanese torpedo. And this big historical what if.
The target 137 miles to the north.
It turns out radar actually picked up the Japanese planes before they struck Pearl Harbor.
They picked up the planes at 7:02, 30 minutes.
But they were wrongly thought to be American. In many ways, I was most struck by the museum's last set of exhibits on what Pearl Harbor and World War II meant for the local people of Hawaii. It's a part of the story too long overlooked. Martial law, gas masks, nightly blackouts, the fear of an impending Japanese invasion.
Those that were known to be disloyal or undercover enemy agents were immediately taken into custody.
Consider this. More than 1/3 of Hawaii's population in 1941 was of Japanese ancestry. Most of them weren't sent to internment camps like Japanese Americans on the West Coast.
Closed are the language schools.
But their loyalty was still questioned. Many Hawaiians of Japanese descent tried to downplay their cultural heritage. A large number joined the U.S. Army, forming the 442 Regimental Combat Team. It became one of the most decorated units in American history. It's a Friday night, and that usually means there's a party at the house of famed Hawaiian musician Ledward Kaopana. There's plenty of food, drink, and music. When Hawaiians get together, they also like to talk story. That's a local phrase that means a little gossip, some shooting the breeze, and the sharing of memories.
History, no? I get so much history. That's why she's fascinated with me.
Jimmy Miyakawa, Alice Kanemori, and Joanne Matsuda are Japanese Americans who were alive on December 7, 1941.
Yes, I'm a Pearl Harbor baby, and my mom told me she was still in the hospital.
Joanne was only 5 days old, but she grew up hearing the stories.
When they bombed Pearl Harbor, she was still in the hospital.
Wow.
And then they had the blackout, you know. So she told the doctor she wants to go home, you know.
Alice was a young girl.
I was at church, and they told us to go home. Then looked up in the sky, all those black smokes, all those bombs. We couldn't go to Japanese school because they were all banned. So we used to go English school and Japanese school, but we couldn't go Japanese school.
My father, December 8th, FBI came to my house and took my father away.
Jimmy and his family were sent to a relocation center far from home.
I was in Arkansas, 1942, 15 years old. Our camp was fenced up right around. The government spent so much money for, anybody cannot come in.
And you cannot go out?
Yeah, cannot go out.
Cannot go out. How long you stayed there?
1942 to 1945.
Oh, wow.
Jimmy went on to serve his country in the Korean War.
Jimmy, I know you like.
And he says he doesn't hold any grudges against his government. He says forgiveness is just part of the spirit of Hawaii.
Yeah, you don't hold anything. That's the thing, you gotta let it out. And all that stuff comes from music.
The music of Hawaii is a perfect metaphor for the islands themselves. A blend of different cultures, styles, and ages. Listening to it and coming here, I can't help but think that perhaps we are lucky that Pearl Harbor is in Hawaii. If any place can promote reconciliation and peace among peoples, it is here.
Yeah, Jimmy. Uncle Jimmy over here.
Just a few miles from the bustle of Waikiki, cradled inside an extinct volcanic crater, lies one of the island's most peaceful spots. This is the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, known commonly as Punch Bowl. On these sacred grounds lie the remains of more than 50,000 Americans, most of whom either died or served in our great Asian wars: World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Leaders of nations often talk about what might have been if a certain action hadn't been taken. What might have been if we had gotten into the war later. What might have been if we gotten earlier. But the might have been that pierces my heart the most is what might have been for each one of these names, and even those whose names are not known, what might have happened to their lives when their families sat around the dinner table on, say, Thanksgiving Day, and there's an empty place at the table. They think of what might have been in a whole different way.
I'd like to quote an unknown source that says a veteran is defined as an individual who has signed a blank check payable to the United States government for amount up to and including his life.
Gene Castagnetti oversees these grounds. The steely retired Marine colonel who earned a Silver Star in Vietnam is just the kind of guy you'd hope would be in charge of a place like this. What thought comes to your mind most often as you go about your work here?
Well, on a personal basis, I am very pleased that I can come here every day and be reminded that we have an obligation to the legacy of those people that preceded us to make sure we continue to serve our nation in whatever capacity in order to follow the ideals of democracy and freedom.
Castagnetti estimates that about 3.5 million visitors come to Punch Bowl each year, many on guided bus tours that will also take them to Pearl Harbor. Other visitors come on their own, walking amongst the graves in quiet reflection.
We have over 14,000 World War II casualties interred at this national shrine. The names are there. The state that they came from is there. And when you look at those graves and you see that name memorialized in stone, it brings to life that this was somebody who was a viable personality. You don't know what they could have become if they had lived longer. But when you look at these graves and you see short lives, maybe 22 years old is an average age of World War II, and you say, what if they hadn't gone to war? What if they hadn't served our country?
Well, it's been my experience that those who carry the burden of sacrifice, I saw it in Vietnam, I've seen it any number of times since, there's also pride in carrying that burden.
Well, I'd like to quote my boss, Secretary of the VA, General Shinseki. Fought in Vietnam, was wounded in Vietnam, and he always says, our veterans are our finest citizens. They served and gave that full last measure of devotion. Maybe we hold our head a little higher and walk with a little more swagger and maybe exert an overconfident feeling, but those are the things that get us through tough times. The crucibles and trials and tribulations of life when you're tested in combat.
The grave sites at Punch Bowl are now full, with a few exceptions, but they still accept cremated remains. Many funerals are held here, like this one of a Vietnam veteran.
Ma'am, on behalf of the President of the United States, the Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a token of our appreciation for the service of your loved one to country and Corps.
Being up here, the Hawaii of beach vacations and luxury hotels feels very far away. The mercurial weather and taste of the Pacific air makes one feel closer, physically and emotionally, to the battles Americans have been called to fight in the Pacific and Asia. Wars we don't think enough about. But if you come to Punch Bowl and take some time to walk around, you will likely get new insights about what took place in the Pacific. Overlooking the grave sites is an impressive memorial with a unique approach to teaching history.
Well, I love these maps done as mosaics. This is an overview, if you will, in mosaic of the war in the Pacific. And even though I was alive and a memory age and remember it, when you see this, and keep in mind at the same time we were engaged in a battle literally to the death against the forces of Nazism in Europe, it still sort of takes one back.
Yes, sir.
So many of these things come back to me, having heard on the radio reports, New Guinea, important to hold it, to protect Australia, and also to keep sea lanes open. I mean, just dateline after dateline of the war. Philippines, Battle of Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Wake Island, which fell so early in the war, Tarawa, the Gilbert Islands. It just goes on and on and on. You could stand here 2 or 3 hours. It'd take you through the whole history of the World War II. Any of these locations, you were younger, but spark off memories in your mind when
Well,
you were
yes,
small?
sir, because as I shared with you, my uncle landed at Guadalcanal on August 7th, 1942, as a young 19-year-old Marine. And he talks about what it was like to be uprooted out of Massachusetts, volunteer for the Marine Corps, and find himself in a place he couldn't even pronounce. And That was a critical juncture where the United States says, we're going on the offensive.
If you're interested, you can come in here and earn at least a master's and maybe a PhD in history by just studying these mosaics.
Yes, sir, and I think this is why this National Shrine has also been such a tourist attraction.
Yeah, we went to New Caledonia in 1942.
Well, Dad was at Funafuti at the same time that they were there, and it talks about how the bombing of Funafuti and how Corporal Ladd thought
The vastness of these places of names forgotten.
Places like the Tarawa Atoll, a tiny stretch of sand now mostly forgotten.
The relief map of our objective is broken out. Fortified island of Betio and the Tarawa Atoll, a very important Jap air base on the outer fringe of their Pacific defenses.
I remember in late 1943 when Tarawa captivated the nation. The battle footage of Marines hitting the beach is still seared in my mind. It's almost impossible to overstate how brutal the fighting was in the Pacific and how bloody.
These are Marine dead. This is the price we have to pay for a war we didn't want. These are the Marines who took Tarawa.
The maps are accompanied by walls and walls of text that fill in details and highlight battle names in bold. It is not uncommon for visitors to ponder these large mosaics for long periods of time, and the thought of that brings a smile to the face of an artist in her late 80s, still working in her studio in rural Maryland. Mary Morse is the woman behind the artwork at Punchbowl. A 2-year-long project she started 40 years ago. She knows it will be her most enduring work.
What an honor to be able to honor the dead that fought so hard for this country. All along, it never seemed like work, although I would work till 3 o'clock in the morning when I had a deadline to meet. I realized I was doing a big and important thing, and it was a monument to the dead of all the people. But I didn't realize it would be such a tourist attraction. I've gotten all these letters from people thanking me, and that surprised me. I was just doing my artwork the best I knew how. And I loved the fact that I was able to show people shooting guns and the wonderful battleships with water flowing up around them, and all these wonderful images that I could put down. I enjoyed it, and it was a great joy to do it. And my worst problem sometimes was getting an idea of how to show a certain thing. I have a couple of soldiers carrying a wounded man. I have Iwo Jima, where they had the flamethrowers. The Japanese were hiding in caves, and the only way they could get them out was put a flamethrower in, and I have one of those in there too. So I try to cover all services, and I felt it was important that no one be forgotten. It all speaks of what they did.
Morse said she had a few creative differences with the general overseeing the project.
I had a picture of men shooting a big gun. I had them with their pants legs rolled up and stripped to the waist, and you know, like you would if it in a very hot climate and everything, and they were working hard. And he said, Mary, he said, I want you to clean that up. I want uniforms on them. And I said, General Adams, I said, do you want people to look at it the way it was, or the way we're like mannequins up there? Because no one would ever fight like that. And I had a talk with him about it, and I was so happy that I won out.
When Morse was working on the maps, America was in the midst of the divisive Vietnam War. And while there is a map for the Korean conflict at Punchbowl, there's not one for Vietnam, at least not yet.
Well, they called me up and asked if they could come out and talk to me about doing the Vietnam Memorial in Hawaii. And I said, fine, come on out. And so they did.
So for now, she's back for long hours in her studio, studying old war photos, sketching and painting.
I'm very excited about doing the next one, and I was very surprised at my age that they would want me to do it. Hopefully, people will appreciate it in the future, after I'm gone. And the important part is not me. The important part is the monument. That's what speaks. I can only speak now on television, but what really speaks and will never be quiet is what is said in the monument.
Colonel Castagnetti took me to a section of the cemetery that few visitors know about.
You have Hatcher and Hatcher, Brock and Brock, all these brothers.
A place where 21 sets of brothers who died during World War II are buried side by side.
So this is sacred ground, as we say, because the enormity of the sacrifice is very visible here.
Overlooking the more than 100 acres is a statue of Columbia, and beneath her, a line from a letter Abraham Lincoln wrote to a Mrs. Bixby, a mother he heard had lost 5 sons in the Civil War. It reads, "The solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom." Personal question.
Yes, sir.
Is this where you expect to have your final resting place, or would it be at Arlington National Cemetery?
No, this is going to be my final resting place, sir. I'm going to be right here, and it's the place I love. I've dedicated a second career to it, and I wouldn't want to be anyplace else.
Visit one of our national cemeteries and you'll get a poignant lesson in democratic ideals. All grave markers are the same in size and shape, regardless of the military rank of the man or woman interred. At Punchbowl, that uniformity also holds true for the thousands of names etched in marble in what are known as the courtyards of the missing. Listings of more than 28,000 names of those who are missing in action, lost at sea, or buried at sea in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. As the saying goes, their final resting place, known only to God. Yet one summer morning, a colleague of mine came across a site that brought one of those names into sharp relief. A 24-word handwritten note hung from a hibiscus tree where it had been protected from the elements for 2 months in plastic lamination. "Dear Sammy," it read, "we're here. It's been 66 years since you were lost. Today is June 10th, 2011, and we are overdue. Love, your family." A photocopied newspaper article from 1945 told us that Sammy was Sam Bowerman, a coxswain missing and presumed dead off the coast of Okinawa.
There was a picture of a sailor on the wall that we never really got to ask many questions about. Just something that wasn't discussed.
I just think we're dealing with a generation that were a lot more private.
Ron and Bob Bowerman, their younger brother Tim, and sister Cheryl spent a lot of time at their Grandma Lula's house where the topic of World War II and their lost Uncle Sam was not discussed.
We got to the point where you didn't ask about the picture. I still think the day she died, she'd swear that he was still there, that he was not gone. It was a mother's prerogative, I guess, to say, no, my son is not dead.
Even their father, Harry, their Uncle Sam's younger brother, didn't want to talk about it.
My father, to the day he died, would not listen to White Christmas. because
Bing Crosby.
that song was very popular right when Sam died.
Right.
And whenever that would come on the radio, we liked it. As kids, why Dad? Well, I don't like that song. He turned it off because that was too hard for him to listen to.
After their father went into a nursing home, Tim was cleaning up a basement closet in the family house when he came across an old suitcase.
I opened it, and out fall all these pictures, and then that box with the medals. And I'm like, holy crap.
There were letters, an old logbook,
He couldn't go stateside without first getting to Pearl Harbor.
and suddenly the mysterious sailor whose picture they had seen for years started to come into focus. Their uncle had had a fiancée. He'd seen action across the Pacific, and he was killed by a kamikaze attack.
It's really hard to be afraid of anything when you consider that these men were out in the ocean sitting on an anti-aircraft gun with a plane diving down at 300 to 400 miles an hour destined to kill them. And you just have to sit there and keep shooting. There's nowhere to go.
But perhaps the most emotional artifact they discovered was a letter written by the captain of the ship to their grandparents.
My dear Mr. and Mrs. Bowerman, your son Samuel has been officially classified as missing in action at almost 5:30 in
The captain wrote how Sam was seen helping with the wounded. After his life jacket caught fire, he jumped into the water. A long scouring of the sea, the letter said, failed to find a trace of him. Words cannot express the shock and sorrow of myself and the rest of Samuel's shipmates
in the loss of so fine a man.
The documents began to answer questions that the Bowerman children had had for years, like why their grandmother clung to them so fiercely.
If I wandered off and I didn't tell her I was going over to the neighbor kid's place, it was Robert.
Yes,
and she was over the fence.
I've heard that a number of times.
Right, she was.
Bob said he always sensed that his grandmother had considered him something of a surrogate for her dead son. And now he was beginning to feel a special connection to his Uncle Sam as well.
And my children asked me if there's any place on earth I wanted to go, and I said I'd like to go to Pearl Harbor.
Bob enjoyed Hawaii like a tourist.
All you're going up there for is a coconut, Bob.
His brother Ron and Ron's wife Jane joined him on the trip. But the Bowermans had come here with a purpose. A moment 66 years in the making that would take place on the Arizona Memorial.
Dedicate this to the families of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Bowerman. Letter from the Canada USS Galena. Your son Samuel has been officially classified as missing in action.
You can't see it, but the whole time he's reading the letter, I'm pinching these trapezius muscles to keep him so he'd get through it.
It's like, oh, that's nice your brother had his arm around you. I said, he was squeezing my neck so hard so that I wouldn't cry. I don't understand that either because it's not me. I'm a rough, tough collegiate football player, football coach. Other than when I'm getting a splinter out of my thumb, I'm pretty tough. But I can't explain it. It's just the thing in my life that I had to take care of. That, whether he went or whether my younger brother went or whether, it's just I've got to get there and see this to the end.
I'll be here.
Then, in line with the Hawaiian tradition they'd heard about, they cut their leis and tossed them in the water. In a moment that gave them shivers, the flowers briefly spelled out an S and an A, the first two letters of their uncle's name.
So all we needed was the M. Looking up the mountain at the Lady of who is it, Jane?
After the Arizona, they went to Punch Bowl and found their uncle's name in the courts of the missing.
Jane found it.
It was there that they left the letter, the one we found in the tree.
Dear Sammy, we're here. It's been 66 years since you were lost. Let's begin with what we didn't know. All we had on the wall at Grandpa and Grandma's was that big picture because all of this stuff was hidden.
Back in Ohio, they gathered 3 generations of Bowermans together to share what they had learned, and hopefully add the memory of a new member to the family tree.
And the 87-year-old lady that knew him said he was a good-looking man. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, this is the first real formal attempt at closure for someone who was lost 66 years ago. Because, I mean, to have a funeral, you have to talk about it, and no one would even talk about it.
There you go, Sammy.
A great Ohioan. The sad part is there's still a need for letters such as the one my grandmother got. And there's still a need for, you know, death announcements for young men who are fighting because we're still at war. America's still at war.
Our touchstone will remain the 25th Combat Aviation Brigade motto, Lele Mako'u Nona Puale. We fly for the troops. We fly for the troops until the fight on the ground is won.
We are indeed a nation still at war, and we have been for a decade. Hawaii, with its 11 military bases in such a small, confined space, seems closer in many ways to these wars than other parts of the country. On many mornings, the first boat out to the Arizona Memorial is not carrying tourists. American servicemen and women can request to have special ceremonies, re-enlistments, and promotions at this hallowed site.
I, Brian Withrow.
I, Brian Withrow.
Do solemnly swear.
Do solemnly swear.
To support and defend.
To support and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
Against all enemies.
Against all enemies.
Foreign and domestic.
Foreign and domestic.
And that I will bear true faith and allegiance.
That I will bear true faith and allegiance.
To the same.
To the same.
And that I will obey the orders.
We came to Hawaii to tell the story of the past and our need to remember it. But the more I was here, the more I realized this place is as much about the present and the future. I think if we do a better job of teaching history, there will be no shortage of students who will benefit from its lessons.
My grandchildren sat down one day and asked me to tell them the story about my history at Pearl Harbor. And I began telling the story, and I noticed my son sat down. And I said, "Why are you interested?" And he said, "Dad, you never talked about it. We never had time to talk about it. You were busy getting an education, busy getting a job after your education, raising a family. It didn't seem very important at that time."
Long before Pearl Harbor was turned into a modern port, these waters were an important meeting place for the native Hawaiians. It's a reminder that with history, there's always a before and an after. I remembered an old Hawaiian song about separation and the passage of time that captured my feelings perfectly. For Hawaiian musicians like Ledward Ka'apana, it's a song they've known since childhood. Aloha Oe.
Aloha Oe is like a farewell song. Somebody comes to Hawaii, and then we get, get so attached to them, and then when they leave, this song comes out to say, "We love you, aloha. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being my friend. Thank you for everything."
Well, it is a song of longing and farewell.
And farewell.
Is it a song that likely would have been played to soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who were leaving Hawaii to go to World War II?
Yes.
Well, let's let the music speak. Can you play it for us?